So here are the answers to the questions at the end of the previous chapter. Hopefully you've got all these right. So why don't you tick these off before we go on to generating electricity. First. Let's have a look at energy sources. First of all, the ones that we use to heat water. Some power stations burn fossil fuels to heat water, so they burn coal, oil or gas. The water gets hot, it starts producing steam, and the steam that's produced is used to drive a turbine, which is a spinny round thing. Now the turbine itself doesn't generate electricity, it's coupled to a generator, and it's the generator which changes that kinetic energy of the turbine into electrical energy. Nuclear power stations use uranium and plutonium, whose nuclear fission reactions are used to heat water. These are reactions which give out heat. We don't burn nuclear fuels. Biofuels can also be burnt to heat water, and biogas, for example, is methane, which is produced from animal and plant waste. We also have growing use of renewable energy sources. Wind and moving water can be used to drive turbines directly. So for example, we can use waves, tides and falling water in hydroelectric schemes. Solar cells can also produce electricity from the sun's radiation, and then there's geothermal energy, or energy from hot rocks. This uses the hot water and the steam produced by volcanic areas to drive turbines. Carbon capture and carbon storage. Now, to prevent any further CO2 building up in the atmosphere, we're looking for new ways of capturing it and storing it when it's released by combustion of fuels. What we're not talking about is trying to get the CO2 out of the atmosphere that's already there. That would be kind of difficult. What we're talking about is scrubbing CO2 out of the waste gases produced by power stations. And we're looking at using old oil and gas fields. These are huge containers, they're suitable for this job. The other thing that we're having to do in reducing emissions is to look at, for example, burning less fuel, or using more nuclear power, or making more use of renewables. Okay, so you may be asked in an exam question to make a comparison of the different energy sources. So let's have a look at them. Starting with fossil fuels, the advantage of fossil fuels is that they're reliable. You can burn coal, oil and gas whenever you want to. It doesn't depend upon the weather in the way that some of the renewables does. But the disadvantage is that they produce emissions, carbon dioxide gas, for example, and other things, which are harmful to the environment, and they're harmful on a global scale. Whatever gases you produce will blow around the whole planet. It's not just a local thing. And the other problem is that fossil fuels are running out. There's nuclear fuels. Now, the advantage of these is they're reliable as well. You don't depend on the weather for those, and they're a concentrated source of energy. But the disadvantage is that nuclear power stations have a finite lifespan. They have to be decommissioned at the end of their lifespan, which means they have to be dismantled and disposed of safely. And of course, they produce hazardous nuclear waste, which has to be stored safely. Biofuels. Now, these are things like methane and ethanol, which can be burnt to release energy. Now, they're regarded as carbon neutral because biofuel crops take in CO2 in photosynthesis, and then it releases CO2 when it's burned. They're reliable, which means that we can burn them whenever we want to. They're renewable, we can grow as much as we want to. And some of them use plant and animal waste, which means that it's free. But the disadvantage is that they still do generate CO2 and other emissions in the production of biofuel. There's CO2 used in growing of crops, for example, by the tractors and the machinery that are used. Land and other resources are being used for producing biofuels instead of food. And then there's the traditional renewables. There's wind, wave, solar, tidal and hydroelectric power. Now, these don't produce any emissions once they've been built, and they're free once they've been built. And there are low running costs, and these sources of energy are renewable. The disadvantage is that they do have a large initial cost when they're installed, and they're unreliable. It does depend on the weather, it does depend on the time of day, and of course when all these large installations are being manufactured, CO2 is emitted during their manufacture. They can also present hazards to wildlife, and some people say that they also cause visual pollution. They're not very pretty to look at. Okay, so quickly test yourself. Hopefully you've printed out all these notes so you can answer it now and find the answers at the beginning of the next chapter.